Okay, so I always feel like I have to apologize a little bit in advance for this class period. It's probably one of the most boring 50 minutes of the rest of your life. I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. Yesterday we talked about plagiarism. We talked about how easy it is to commit plagiarism accidentally, in part because you're not applying the MLA documentation requirements with attention to detail. With the exception of 2 students that we looked at last class period in those examples, all of those students committed plagiarism accidentally. They had good intentions, they just slipped up in some aspect of MLA documentation and it cost them dearly. So what we're going to do today is go over some of those MLA details, make sure you understand how MLA works, why it works the way it works, and sort of go through another one of my favorite little driving analogies or metaphors for how to get it in your mind, all the steps necessary anytime you're using a source, okay? So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how we got to the MLA system. So I put on the board the footnote system for documentation, which we will not be using, okay? But it's important to understand a few things about it to understand the logic of the MLA system. So the footnote system would have you, after you've used a source, insert a superscript numeral, and then have a corresponding numeral with the full bibliographic information on the last pages of the document. This is called the endnote system, actually. Footnotes would technically have them at the bottom of the page. So actually, let me go ahead and change that. We'll call it endnote system. You don't get too confused. But the logic here is that anytime you use a source, you have a number, you have a corresponding number, and it's on the endnote page where we find out what page you're citing, who the person is, perhaps, that you're citing. And the logic of this system was that it makes for very efficient reading. You don't have a lot of documentation stuff gumming up the text while you're reading, right? It's easy to skate over a numeral, and if you really care who is being cited in number 1 or number 2, you can go look. But you don't have to, right? And you're not distracted by citation. The problem with this system, there were a couple of problems. One is that in the absence of a signal phrase, you wouldn't even know who was being cited, right? So let's say you're writing a paper about child development, and you're citing Abraham Maslow. We don't know you're citing Abraham Maslow unless we go back here and look it up. You might be citing, oh, I don't know, Ricky Lake or somebody like that, right? Does Ricky Lake even exist anymore? Yeah. You might be citing, you know, Montel Williams or something. So these are not people who have immediate credibility on these topics. Abraham Maslow does, right? So the one disadvantage is that we don't get as much information about the credibility of your sources in the text of the research paper when you're using endnotes. The other disadvantage was that if you wanted to revise, it created a lot of havoc. Let's say, for example, that you were writing a research paper, and let's say this is page 2 of your research paper, and your teacher said, I really think that you should move these you should switch the order of these 2 paragraphs. You should move your 3rd paragraph up to where your 2nd one is. Well, before the days of computers, if you were to cut this and paste it up here, you would have to retype every single one of your superscript numerals. They did not automatically reorganize themselves, okay? So nobody ever wanted to revise anything or add anything to the first half of their document because every other page in your paper had to be revised in a corresponding fashion to make sure the numbers stayed in the right order, right? Today, Microsoft Word, any word processing program actually does this for us automatically. But nonetheless, that was an issue. Another issue was it was very wasteful of paper. And you might think, well, how can numerals take up more space than names and page numbers? Well, every time you used a source, you had to have a line in the endnotes corresponding to it. So let's say we use Chow here in the first one. We use Chow again. So what we'd have is a little thing that says, I can't remember now whether it's IBID or OPSIT. I think it's IBID, which means same author, different page number. and then you use another source, you'd have the full bibliographic information. Let's say you used this source here, footnote number 3, 8 times in your paper. You would have 8 footnotes associated with it in your endnote sheet. You could have 4 or 5 pages as your endnotes, and multiple pages would have nothing more than a single numeral and the word ibid, 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 ibid page 6, ibid page 9, ibid page 12, right? And it was just kind of wasteful, right? So for the most part, we still have this system, and there are still documentation expectations occasionally that ask for footnotes or endnotes. But for the most part, we've moved away from that. APA and MLA both use an in-text parenthetical and works cited model instead. And it has a number of advantages. One is if Abraham Maslow or David Chow is a renowned expert on something, we know it right here. If I'm writing about cigarette smoking and cancer, and I cite Koop, you know it's C. Everett Koop, former Surgeon General of the United States, and you know that this is a physician that I'm citing, even if it's not included in the signal phrase, which typically it would be. But the other advantage is that I can move things anywhere and not have to reorganize my entire paper and my entire works cited. It doesn't matter whether I use Chow before Jones or Jones before Chow. They will always be in alphabetical order in the bibliography, in the works cited, right? And I can use Jones 57 times in my paper. I don't recommend that. It's probably overusing one source. But I could use Jones 6 times in my paper, and I still only have to have her once in my bibliography, right? So it saves paper. It gives us a little bit more information while we're reading the paper, and we can revise with a little bit more ease. Now there is one catch to this. So, and we'll talk about when you need to give the author's name and when you don't. But let's say I decide that I want to move the second part of my Chow discussion down. I had Chow, page 4. I'm also citing Chow, page 6. But because it's consecutive, I don't need to use the author's name again. If I decide to move Chow down, the second reference to Chow down below my reference to Jones, I need to put Chow's name in again. So the numeral 6 is no longer going to be sufficient. I have to integrate Chow and 6 down here. So otherwise, if I put 6 here, we're going to assume it's Jones, page 6, right? So that's the only thing that makes revision and reorganization of your paper a little bit tricky. You just have to make sure that you use the author's name preceding the integration of the in-text citation. Yeah, Doug?
If you were to copy and paste, or cut and paste that and put it at the bottom of the paper, but accidentally forgot to put Chow's name before the page number, so you would think of Jones, would that be another form of accidental plagiarism?
That's not really considered plagiarism. That's considered a documentation error. You know what I mean? And there's a slight difference. So with plagiarism, you're passing something off as your own, or you're passing something off as being original or new or whatever, and it's not. When, let's say, for example, that you did, well, I like your example. I don't need to think of a different one. So let's say we move this all the way down to the end, and we don't put Jones. Probably at a rough draft stage, I would, and any teacher would say, is this Jones or was this Chow? Just because the page numbers make me think, I don't know. Jones's article is on page 26 to 38. I don't think there's a page 6 in an article that falls on pages 26 to 38. So I would probably think, is this still Jones or is this Chow? So it's confusing documentation and a failure to follow all those rules, but it wouldn't be typically, at least, and it wouldn't be in my class, an F kind of proposition, right? So that's the bottom line. I said it wouldn't be an F, and everyone's like, whew, nodding, right? Okay, so the other thing is, so I can reorganize these, and I don't have to reorganize the works cited. I can cite each author as many times as I want, and I don't have to have multiple works cited entries. If I have multiple articles by Chow, then I would have multiple entries for Chow, but I don't need multiple entries for a single source by Chow if I use it multiple times. So the beauty of this is that it's alphabetical. It's not ordinal, Okay, Ordinal makes things a little bit more complicated. Typically, works cited pages in an English 102 paper are about 2 pages long. So that's not nearly as bad as the length they could be if you were using endnotes. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to describe about this. Questions about any of it? Yeah.
If you have 2 different sources with the same last name, would you just put like the first letter in the first name?
Yeah. So there are a couple of other things. Let's say you have 2 authors with the same last name, or you have 2 sources by the same author. Let's say we have another thing by Chow. Okay, we would so Chow has. Let's say this is Chow too. It's kind of weird when you have 2 things by the same author. You don't put their name a second time in the works cited. You put 3 hyphens and a period. But what we would do here is we would have to give a short version of the title. So we would have Chow, quote, tiger, page 6. And down here, we would have Chow, sports, page, what did I say, 26? Okay, so that would distinguish between those. Now with authors with the same last name, let's double check. So if you look on page 458 in our book, it's on page 480, it's example number 9 on page 458, which is on page 484. I can never remember whether it's the whole name or initial. I think it's just the initial. Ah, okay. It is an initial, and it goes before. So let's say we had 2 Chows. Maybe it's a husband and wife team that wrote separately. We have B Chow, and we have D Chow. And now, because they are different authors, right, we don't actually need the title. One is B Chow, one is D Chow. And it would look like that. Make sense? Here's the key, and I'm glad you asked that question. Just as the Roman numeral, or excuse me, not the Roman numeral, the numeral 1 in an endnote has to match unambiguously with the numeral 1 in the endnotes, the name needs to match unambiguously with the name back here in the works cited. It has to be an exact relationship. It doesn't mean it has to be Chow David in here, right? But we need to see Chow, right? Let's say you were thinking of this article as your Sports Illustrated article. And you said Sports Illustrated, page 6. We are not going to be able to scan down the left edge of your works cited and find under the letter S this article. You see that? Could we go like this and read through and try to figure it out? Yeah, but we're not supposed to have to do that. The reason the hanging indent exists, the reason the first 5 letters hang over, is so you can scan down the left edge and find the article like that, alphabetically. Okay? So let's say this was Jones again. Okay, if we had 2 pages of this in particular, right? If you have 2 sources, having Sports Illustrated, it's not correct MLA documentation, but your reader's not going to have a hard time finding it. It's going to be one of these 2 sources. Which one's the one from Sports Illustrated? But if you have 2 pages of these, your reader's not supposed to have to go like this. Plus, you might have more than one article from Sports Illustrated. If you're writing about Tiger and celebrity scandals and what sports do to major sports figures in terms of the expectations placed on them and the expectations they have for what they deserve, right? You're going to have probably more than one article from Sports Illustrated. Or you're going to have multiple articles from periodicals that have the word sports in their title, right? What's most specific and most needed, both in the signal phrase and in the in-text citation, is the author name, because that is more unique, right? Now let's say you have a source that doesn't have an author. Turns out David Chow was interviewed in this article. He didn't actually write it. The article has no author, as is not uncommon in newspapers and sometimes magazines. Again, we're not going to call it Sports Illustrated. We're going to call this article by its title, which is Tiger Comes Back, in quotation marks, page 6. Okay. Now, alphabetically, it's going to be under T for Tiger, right? It's not going to be under S for Sports Illustrated. It's not going to be under A for Anonymous. It's going to be under T for Tiger. So, yeah.
In the citation, can't you just write a simplified version of the title, like just Tiger?
You could. You can write a shortened and simplified version of the title. It is possible that with it being somebody's name, you might have more than one article. So you have to have enough words in the title to distinguish it from any other article you might use. Typically, we consider 2 to 3 words to be sufficient. So you don't need to reduce it to simply one word. But if you wanted to do Tiger 6, you could do that.
So
Yeah, no, go ahead.
okay, and since it's an article, it's in print. I mean, it's in quotation marks. But if it was like the title of a book, would it be italics?
Italics, yeah. And because there's no real way for me to handwrite italics, I underline them. So underlining symbolizes italics in handwriting. But yes, so Sports Illustrated would be italicized. The article title is in quotation marks. And that's one of the things that we'll see too when we dip into the book here in a minute. That you always put the smaller thing in quotation marks and the larger thing in which it is found in italics. So it is an article from a magazine or an article from a scholarly journal. Similarly, a song from a CD. Okay, CD title would be italicized, song would be in quotation marks, poem in quotation marks, the anthology would be italicized. A particular episode of a television show, the episode title in quotation marks, the title of the show italicized. And that's sort of routine across all media. So a page of a particular website, right? So let's say we go to sportsillustrated.com and we read the article Tiger Strikes Back or Comes Back. That page is in quotation marks, but sportsillustrated.com is italicized.